Good morning. This is Dr. Larry Straub, and welcome to week 5 of your strategic management class. And I am taking the advice of a fellow student of yours that suggested that I do these recordings in 2 different segments, maybe break the chapters out. So I'm going to do that today. So I'll be doing chapter 9 in one video and chapter 10 in a second video. So if you notice a change in the format, you have Angie McCoy to blame for that. So anyway, I thought it was a good suggestion. So I'm going to try that this week if I can remember to cut this off after one chapter, and then I'll do another video on the second one. So I hope you're enjoying the class so far. I've sure enjoyed your readings. I will say that the intent that I had with this class, it's a little unusual this year with the COVID and the pandemic and everything that we're dealing with. So I had to change the deck up a little bit on the strategic management class, but I tried something in terms of having you do 2 different posts, the discussion board and then actually your paper for each week. And I've really been impressed with the way everybody's dug in on the content for each week and the different chapters. And many of you have had really unique takes on some of the different concepts and terms and theories in each of those chapters. Actually, one paper today brought up a particular situation that I'm going to address in my week 10 post. So I've been gaining a lot reading those, and I've really appreciated them. In general, very well written, very well researched, and I think you've all really dug in and done your work and done a great job on those. Okay, so this week we're chapter 9 and chapter 10, and so this video post will be on chapter 9, corporate level strategy, horizontal integration, vertical integration, and strategic outsourcing. And as in past weeks, I'm not going to go through all of that. You've got the textbook, and you can dig in on these topical areas and do a little further research on any of those that you find particularly intriguing. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of specific areas today on each of these chapters to kind of highlight and maybe bring them to life a little bit more. One of the things I want to talk about is complexities of mergers and acquisitions, and even talk a little bit about outsourcing and offshoring. One of the things, particularly on outsourcing, which this chapter specifically talks about, but even throwing in offshoring into that, taking work offshore and bringing it back to the U.S. or wherever your home country is a very controversial topic. Even sometimes outsourcing can be the same way. But there's a lot of different factors that goes into this. One of the papers this last week talked about on outsourcing and offshoring, where I think it was particularly our Spirit cohort. They were talking about when at times when they're doing business with another country and they're putting together a big deal with another country, is they have to promise that a certain amount of the work will be done there. And it can be a political decision, but it's very much a business decision. It's kind of how the game is played in a lot of these things. And so a lot of these deals are put together that way. And so sometimes at the business level, we don't always understand all of the moving parts to these things. And so we scratch our heads and we wonder why we're importing this stuff from a certain place when it could easily be done here in the US or in the home country, and it could probably be done cheaper and maybe even better quality work. But sometimes those politics go into it. On offshoring, whether to offshore, whether to have something done in another country, as much as we like to make it an emotional decision, maybe even a social decision, it's not. It's a business decision. And if we're going to be a sustainable business and we're going to make it for the long haul, we have to look at all of our options. We have to look at everything, and we have to make business decisions based on the facts. Now, my only problem with offshoring, and it really isn't more from a social standpoint, it's from I sometimes don't think businesses identify all of the costs and risks associated with offshoring or even outsourcing, because they are substantial, and they can be numerous: shipping, currency stability, and public relations. Sometimes businesses take a severe PR hit offshoring or outsourcing something, and so those have to be factored into it. But when you really factor in all the costs, if you're able to identify the costs and the risks associated, and there's a substantial advantage that's available for these types of arrangements as a sustainable ongoing business, you about have to do it. Again, I think sometimes businesses jump from A to Z pretty quickly, and they don't go through the stages, and they don't adequately and appropriately assess all of the costs and the risks associated with that. And I will tell you this, as we speak, I guarantee that the calculus has changed. With this pandemic, companies are going to be looking seriously at their production footprints and their value chains. We've had a lot of companies that have been all in the Far East, and they've had a lot of their value chains emanate from there and work from there. And I think that that is going to change significantly, and not just picking on the Far East, whichever parts of the world it is. I think you'll see companies think about more whether they should be diversifying their value chains and their manufacturing footprints, because there were definitely a lot of them that got hung and got hit pretty hard. Another interesting paper this last week talked about that businesses may have to even relook just-in-time inventory. You know, just-in-time has been the gospel of manufacturing and part of the total quality management movement, and it just hasn't really been questioned that much, and it's been a big part of the landscape. Well, again, with this pandemic, there were a lot of businesses that got hit with their value chains. They had empty pipelines. They didn't have a lot of inventory sitting around, because that's not the way we do it anymore, and that kind of caught up with us. So while there are many advantages to these types of arrangements, whether it be outsourcing, offshoring, just-in-time inventory, businesses already have made substantial investments, and these can be quite lucrative. So I don't know that I look for things to change overnight, but I do think that in the future, when businesses are looking at plants, when they're looking at distribution arrangements, when they're looking at any number of things, I think this pandemic will get them to look at the rewards and the risks on many more levels than possibly we would have earlier. So anyway, I think that's an interesting aspect, and I think again, depending on how long this thing lasts, depending on the ultimate costs economically and lives and any number of areas that we actually sustain throughout this, will determine whether we hit the reset button on the other side of this, or whether we really radically change the way that we do business. From what I'm seeing currently, I think there's at least a 50-50 chance right now that we will radically change the way we do business moving forward. So we're very resilient. Who knows? But I think it's going to be hard to just go back and push the reset button on this. Okay, the next thing in Chapter 9 that I wanted to talk about is mergers and acquisitions and kind of the difference between those. Uh, the book, this chapter talks about those a little bit. And in my business, when we had our family business, we did several acquisitions and we did a couple of different mergers. And we were the surviving entity, and we merged the companies that we did mergers with. We merged them into our organization. Now, obviously, the last thing that we did with our company was the sale of our business, and in that case, we were actually acquired. So I know this from a lot of different angles. We did about 4 different acquisitions in our business, and as I said, we did a couple of mergers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference in those and what makes them unique. First of all, acquisitions. They can be very complicated in and of their own right. You have to value assets, you value companies, you have to make sure that you can lock in at least specifically key employees and the majority of the employees with the organization. And you may have to have certain other regulatory or community approvals, different things like that. Our acquisitions were fairly straightforward, but they had complexities. And one of our biggest complexities with our acquisitions was making sure that we had the people secured when we took those dealership operations over. They might have 20 or so employees, and about 5 to 7 of those employees were really, really crucial and really key. So we needed to make sure that we had those. We also had to look at their trends on their business. Were they gaining? Were they losing? And if they were losing, could we stem the tide on that, turn those trends around? And we had to make sure that key long-term customer relationships we would be able to move forward with and things like that. So acquisitions, no doubt about it, they can be very complicated in and of their own right. Now, mergers, on the other hand, they can be much, much more complicated and what makes them different, what makes them more complicated is that you're actually, at the end of the day, one entity is exchanging their stock for your stock, which for us, we were the surviving entity in both cases. So Straub International was the company that was the ongoing company. So the company we merged into our organization, they were actually keeping their capital in our business. They were moving it and exchanging it into our business from their own. So we had to change out their stock and change it into our stock at the end of the day. So what that meant was, what makes that more complicated is to get that exchange ratio right. When you exchange this stock over here for this stock over here, you have to value each company. So you have a two-way valuation. We would value their company, they would value ours. We had to come to agreement on those valuations, which that's a negotiation process, and that can be very complicated in and of itself. But at the end of the day, once we both agree on each other's valuations of the other's company, then we set an exchange rate for the stock price. And when the merger is actually, when we pull the trigger on it and it's actually done, then that exchange rate is in effect, and they give up their stock and we reissue our stock to them at that exchange rate. Now, what's really complicated about it is there can be a lot of emotion involved in this. You've got one entity that's going away, or in some cases the merger creates a whole new entity, and so there's a lot of emotions on each side of it. And literally up to the last 11th hour of a merger, that exchange rate can still be in flux. There can still be ongoing negotiations. You set an initial exchange rate, but that really isn't set in stone until you actually pull the trigger and do the merger itself. And so that's why it's kind of interesting. Another thing that can be interesting about a merger, and this is the way we did one of our mergers, our largest merger we did, when we merged this organization into ours, we actually, don't tell my mother this, but we actually lived in sin for a year. We actually lived together for a year before we actually merged our companies. And this is really, really unique and really unusual. But we ran our companies jointly for a year, but kept them separate to see if we could work together, if we could get along, if we could find common ground to be able to run our businesses. We had both been bitter competitors. I say bitter. We didn't hate each other. We didn't spit venom at each other, but we were very much each other's toughest competitor for a couple of decades. And so we had to figure out if we could get over the personality conflicts, the emotions, different things like that. So we actually ran our operations. We had joint meetings. We worked off each other's inventories, but we kept our books separate for a year. And at the end of that year, we decided that we didn't feel comfortable with it. And so we decided to move ahead. So it worked out really well. It was a little complicated, but it was just much like couples that live together before they get married. It was kind of a trial run, and both of us could pick up our chips and move on, and no harm, no foul. And we signed confidentiality agreements with each other before we entered into that, since we were letting each other know more about each other's businesses. But it actually worked out pretty well at the end of the day. So anyway, that's a little bit of some examples, some differences between mergers and acquisitions. I think it's important to understand that. You see in the business press and even the mainstream press almost every week a major acquisition or a major merger. So it's important to understand the differences between those, especially if you're ever in an organization that goes through those. You'll understand kind of some of the dimensions that these top executives are having to deal with. And they can be quite complicated on either side of it. Okay, well, that is chapter 9, corporate level strategy, horizontal integration, vertical integration, and strategic outsourcing. I will be back with you shortly, and we'll talk about chapter 10.